and he doesn't have all that much experience. Eric King pitches a lot to me like Saberhagen. He pitches like a 30-year-old, and I really like his tenacity. He goes out after the hitters, and he has the guts of a burglar, and that's what you have to win.
Jim Northrup died a tragic death in 2011 at age 71. He battled Alzheimer's disease and rheumatoid arthritis before a seizure ended his life, but the real tragedy wasn't just the illness. It was watching the very things that made him special slowly disappear: his sharp wit, his ability to think quickly, his brilliant mind. All of it faded away. This was the man they called the Silver Fox, the hero who saved the 1968 World Series for Detroit. His life was about more than clutch hits, though. It was about standing up for what's right, even when it cost him everything. Jim Northrup was born James Thomas Northrup in Breckenridge, Michigan. People gave him two nicknames that told you everything about who he was. First, they called him the Gray Fox because his hair turned gray way too early, but the second nickname mattered more. They called him Sweet Lips because he loved to talk and always spoke his mind. He never held back his opinions, and that honesty would define his entire career. Jim took a different path than most baseball players. He was a multi-sport star at Alma College, playing both baseball and football. Because he went to college, he started playing professional baseball. About 5 years later than everyone else, that college education gave him something special. It made him confident in his intelligence, and he could think through problems in ways other players couldn't. Later on, some managers would see this as a threat. They didn't like players who were too smart or too willing to question things. Even though Jim started late, he was incredible in the minor leagues. His career batting average in the minors was .304, which proved he could hit at a high level. He moved up fast and won awards everywhere he went. In 1962, he won the batting championship in the Duluth Superior League with a .324 average. The next year, 1963, he was named Rookie of the Year in the South Atlantic League while playing for Knoxville. But his best minor league season came in 1964 with the Syracuse Sky Chiefs. He hit .3 out of 12 with 18 home runs and drove in 92 runs. They named him International League Rookie of the Year, and everyone knew he was ready for the big leagues. Jim's first game in the major leagues was September 30th, 1964. It didn't go well. He only got one hit in 12 at-bats during his first 5 games. Things got worse in 1965 when he hit just .205 over 80 games. After dominating in the minors for 3 years, why did he suddenly struggle so badly? The answer wasn't about his talent. It was about how the team used him. The Detroit Tigers had an outfield packed with amazing players. There was Hall of Famer Al Kaline, powerful Willie Horton, and defensive star Mickey Stanley with so much talent. Jim couldn't play every day. They made him a platoon player and a pinch hitter. In 1965, he went only 3 for 24 as a pinch hitter. This showed something important about Jim. He was a rhythm player. He needed to play every day to keep his timing and stay hot. When he only played sometimes, he couldn't get into a groove. His AAA season proved he was talented. He just needed consistent at-bats to show what he could do. Before we go further, drop a comment below and tell us which player from the 1968 Tigers you would have loved to see play. Was it Al Kaline, Willie Horton, or maybe Jim Northrup himself? Everything changed in 1968. That season turned Jim from a struggling backup into one of Detroit's most important players. He played in 150 games and led the entire team in 2 major categories. He had the most hits with 153 and drove in the most runs with 90. He wasn't just contributing anymore, he was carrying the team. Jim became known for hitting in the most important moments. He hit 5 grand slams during the 1968 season. In June, he did something incredible. He hit 3 grand slams in 1 week. Even more amazing, 2 of those grand slams came in back-to-back at-bats against the Cleveland Indians. During his career, he also broke up 3 different no-hitters. He always seemed to come through when it mattered most. But Jim's hitting was streaky. The same week he hit 3 grand slams. He also struck out twice with the bases loaded. This shows how tough he was mentally. Most players would have been crushed after failing in those big moments. Jim bounced back immediately and kept hitting. That mental toughness was part of what made him special. Manager Mayo Smith made a bold decision for the World Series that showed how valuable Jim had become. Mickey Stanley was the regular center fielder and had won a Gold Glove award for his defense, but Smith moved Stanley to shortstop, a position he'd never played before. He did this to replace Ray Oyler, who couldn't hit well. The move let Smith keep Jim Northrup, Willie Horton, and Al Kaline in the lineup every day, with Jim playing center field. This was risky. If Stanley struggled at shortstop, people would blame Smith for the move, but the numbers proved it was the right call. Jim had a 5.3 WR that season, which was almost as good as Willie Horton's 5.2 WAR. His bat was too powerful to keep out of the lineup. Stanley only made 2 errors and 34 chances at shortstop, so the defense held up, but it was Jim's hitting that made the whole strategy work. The World Series against the St. Louis Cardinals was where Jim became a Detroit legend. In Game 6, with the Tigers facing elimination, he hit a grand slam off pitcher Larry Jaster. They won that game 13-1, tying the series and forcing a Game 7. Game 7 was the defining moment of Jim's entire career. The Tigers faced Bob Gibson, one of the greatest pitchers who ever lived. Gibson seemed impossible to beat. The score was tied going into the 7th inning. Jim came up with 2 outs and runners on base. He delivered a 2-run triple that scored Norm Cash and Willie Horton. Those runs gave Detroit a lead they never gave up. The Tigers won 4-1 and captured their first championship in 23 years, but there was controversy around that triple. St. Louis center fielder Curt Flood appeared to misjudge the ball. Many people outside Detroit said the hit only happened because Flood made an error. They acted like it wasn't really a great hit, just a mistake by the defense. This bothered Jim for the rest of his life. Decades later, he was still upset about how people remembered that moment. He felt like saying Flood messed up took away from what Jim had actually done. He needed people to understand the truth. It wasn't about a defensive mistake. It was about him delivering in the biggest moment possible. In 1998, Jim was still angry about it. When someone brought up the play, he got physically intense and said something he really meant. He said there was no way Flood could have caught that ball. He hit it 20 feet over Flood's head. He was disappointed that outside Detroit, people called it the Curt Flood play instead of the Jim Northrup hit. This need to defend his accomplishment showed something important about his character. He cared more about the truth than about accepting an easier story that made him look less skilled. This same honesty would cause problems later in his career. After 1968, Jim's time with the Tigers became difficult because of manager Billy Martin, who took over in the early 1970s. Jim hated how Martin managed the team. He thought he should play every day, but Martin benched him against certain left-handed pitchers. Jim also couldn't stand how Martin would blame players for losses and take credit for wins. One time, Jim's anger exploded. He told Martin that if he didn't want to manage the team, he should get out. That was a direct challenge to the manager's authority, and it made their relationship even worse. Jim's criticism went beyond just disagreeing with baseball decisions. He attacked Martin's character. He said publicly that he had no respect for Martin. He called him dishonest and a user. He said Martin was a huckster who manipulated the press and fans. He went even further, calling Martin paranoid and schizophrenic. Then he said something that connected back to his own background. He said Martin was threatened by anyone who was a college graduate. This showed the real source of their conflict. Jim's college education gave him intellectual confidence. Martin saw that confidence as a threat to his authority. After the first year, Martin would blame players for every defeat. The players lost all respect for him. In 1972, the team decided to win in spite of their manager. Not because of him. The worst moment came after a tough loss. Martin stormed into the locker room and challenged any player who wanted to fight him to come into his office. Willie Horton urged Jim to take the challenge, but Jim showed how smart he really was. He refused to fight Martin. He said he wasn't going to give Martin the satisfaction of seeing management trade him away. He knew he would pound Martin and then be gone from the team. This decision proved Jim could control his emotions when it mattered. He wanted to fight Martin, but he knew the consequences. If he did it, he would lose his career. Martin was impulsive and emotional. Jim was calculating and smart. By refusing to fight, he proved everything he'd said about Martin was true. He also showed he could think strategically even when he was angry. The tension between them represented something bigger than just two men who didn't like each other. It was about authority versus independence. It was about managers who demanded blind loyalty versus players who thought for themselves. Jim represented a new kind of ball player, one who wouldn't just follow orders without question, one who valued truth and integrity over keeping his head down and collecting a paycheck. This made him dangerous to people like Martin who needed complete control. The conflict showed that baseball was changing. Players were becoming more educated, more willing to stand up for themselves, more willing to call out hypocrisy when they saw it. Jim was ahead of his time in many ways, and that made his career harder than it should have been. The relationship between players and managers in that era was built on a military-style hierarchy. Managers expected complete obedience and rarely tolerated questions or criticism. Players were supposed to accept whatever decisions were made without complaint. This system worked when players had limited education and few options, but as more players attended college and understood their value, the old system began to break down. Jim was part of that transition. He represented a future where players had more power and autonomy, where they could speak up about unfair treatment without fear of immediate retaliation. But that future hadn't fully arrived yet, so Jim paid a price for being ahead of his time. His conflicts with Martin weren't just personality clashes, they were battles over how baseball should be structured, who should have power, and whether players had the right to question authority. Jim had strong opinions about everything in baseball, not just managers. When people talked about steroids and performance-enhancing drugs, he gave an honest answer that most people wouldn't say out loud. He admitted steroids were illegal, but he said owners chose to look the other way. Why? Because home runs are good for the game and good for making money. Baseball didn't want to catch the users. Jim said it was always about money. The owners didn't care about the integrity of the game or the players' health. It had always been about money and always would be. Then he said something even more shocking. He admitted he probably would have taken steroids himself to earn more money and increase his salary, but he added an important condition. He would have required blood tests to check for health dangers. This wasn't about cheating in Jim's mind. It was a calculated financial transaction. He saw the system as corrupt, driven by profit. If he played within that corrupt system to make money, that was just being realistic. But he did criticize modern players who lied about using steroids. He said Barry Bonds was no Willie Mays and never would be. The lying was the problem, not the decision to use the drugs. His views on steroids revealed something important about his philosophy. Jim believed in honesty above all else. He didn't judge people for making choices that benefited them financially, especially in a system that was already corrupt. But he couldn't stand dishonesty and pretending. If you were going to use steroids, own it. Don't lie to fans and pretend you achieved everything naturally. That hypocrisy bothered him more than the actual drug use. Jim also had ideas about how to change baseball. He claimed he suggested interleague play back in the 1960s. Commissioner William Harridge dismissed the idea, saying interleague play already existed in spring training. This showed Jim was thinking ahead about the business side of baseball, not just playing. In other ways, Jim was very traditional. He hated pitch counts and would scold teammates for being friendly with players on the other team. That was old school thinking, but he was fine with the designated hitter, which showed he could accept some changes. After Jim retired in 1975, following short stints with the Montreal Expos and Baltimore Orioles, he stayed involved with baseball. He played professional softball for a couple of years with former Tigers teammate Norm Cash. He also started a business called Jim Northrup and Associates in Southfield, Michigan. From 1985 to 1994, Jim worked as a color analyst for Tigers television broadcast on the Pass Sports Cable Network. He often worked with Al Kaline, and fans loved listening to him. But his broadcasting career ended suddenly. New ownership took over and fired him. The reason they gave was incredibly revealing. They were afraid Jim would be too critical of the new regime. This was exactly like his conflict with Billy Martin. Once again, people in power saw Jim's honesty and analytical thinking as a threat. They wanted someone who would say what they wanted to hear, not someone who would tell the truth. Jim was an old schooler who had strong opinions and loved to talk. Those qualities made him great on television, but they also made management nervous. They wanted control, and they knew Jim would never give them that. The broadcasting industry was changing. Networks wanted announcers who would promote the team and keep fans happy. They didn't want critical voices who might point out problems or question decisions. Jim's firing represented a larger shift in sports media, away from honest analysis and toward corporate messaging. It was another example of how his integrity cost him professionally, but it also proved he never compromised who he was, even when staying quiet would have been easier and more profitable. In 2000, Jim was inducted into the Michigan Sports Hall of Fame. That recognition honored everything he'd accomplished on the field, but later in life, he faced his toughest battle. He developed rheumatoid arthritis, which was painful. Then he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The Alzheimer's diagnosis was particularly cruel for Jim. His entire identity was built on being smart, quick-witted, and able to express complex ideas. The disease slowly took all of that away. The very qualities that defined who he was, his sharp mind and ability to speak his truth, gradually disappeared. Watching someone with such a powerful intellect lose their mental faculties is heartbreaking. For Jim's family and friends, it must have been especially difficult. This was a man who always had something to say, who could analyze any situation and express his thoughts clearly. Now he was losing the ability to think and communicate. The progression of Alzheimer's is cruel and relentless. It strips away everything that makes a person who they are. For someone like Jim, whose mind was his greatest asset beyond his physical skills, the loss was devastating. Memories of his greatest moments, his World Series heroics, his battles with Billy Martin, all of it slowly faded from his consciousness. The man who spent decades defending the truth about his Game 7 triple eventually forgot it ever happened. That's the cruelty of Alzheimer's. It doesn't just take away the future, it erases the past. On June 8, 2011, Jim died in Holly, Michigan. He was 71 years old. A seizure related to his Alzheimer's disease ended his life. Jim Northrup's legacy is about two things. First, his clutch performance in the 1968 World Series, especially that Game 7 triple off Bob Gibson, made him a Detroit hero forever. His career numbers were solid. A .267 batting average, 153 home runs, and 610 runs batted in. Those statistics show he was a productive power hitter whose best years made a huge impact, but his second legacy might be even more important. Jim was a voice of dissent who always prioritized truth over convenience. He spent decades defending his Game 7 hit against the narrative that it was Flood's error. He ruthlessly analyzed Billy Martin, calling him dishonest and a user. He gave a pragmatic, economically focused view of steroid use that most people wouldn't dare express. His honesty caused professional problems. He calculated carefully to avoid fighting Martin because he knew it would end his career. Years later, he was fired from broadcasting for being too critical, but that same honesty is what made him unforgettable. He spoke his mind and proved that candor and calculation, even when they caused institutional problems, could secure an unforgettable place in history. Jim Northrup was the Silver Fox, a hero of the diamond and a resolute critic of baseball's management. He He hit when it mattered most and never backed down from speaking the truth. His story reminds us that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to compromise your values, even when it costs you opportunities, even when it makes people uncomfortable, even when staying quiet would be easier. Jim never took the easy path. He challenged authority when he believed it was wrong. He defended his accomplishments when others tried to diminish them. He spoke honestly about controversial topics when others remained silent. That kind of courage is rare in any field, but especially in professional sports where conformity is often rewarded and dissent is punished. His willingness to speak truth to power, whether that power was Billy Martin or team ownership or the baseball establishment itself, marked him as someone special, not just an athlete, but a thinker, not just a player, but a critic of the game he loved. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us what you think about Jim's legacy. Should more players speak out like he did, or is it better to stay quiet? Let us know below.